You might see that I'm surrounded by Epipremnum plants, and I've got lots of varieties to show you today. I'll also run through a complete care guide of how to look after your plants, keep them happy and healthy, whether you decide to leave them as trading plants or let them climb. Also some tips on how to get fuller looking plants. Now, in looking at where Epipremnums come from, it can be a little bit confusing because there is a bit of a mix-up with the names, particularly of the popular houseplant varieties such as the Aureum and Pinnatum. However, they seem to come from specific places, but they have also been naturalised in other areas, so they grow in the wild there. So generally the Aureum is from the Society Islands, the Pinnatum is from the Solomon Islands, and they have been naturalised, as I said, in other areas, so they grow in the wild across Southeast Asia, Australasia and the West Pacific. They are different species of Epipremnum, and I've got lots of varieties within both of those species. However, if you Google these, or just Google Epipremnum, you will find that they are often interchanged, so you'll have Aureums called Pinnatums, Pinnatums called Aureums, or even Aureum and Pinnatum used in the same name, which is just incorrect. So I've done a bit of research on this to try and get to the bottom of it and find out what was going on with all this naming. Are they different plants or not? And they are. And I've relied on the Royal Botanical Gardens of Kew. They have a fantastic database of all the scientific background of different plants as well as the taxonomy. So these are different species. I've got varieties of Pinnatum. So this one is an Epipremnum Pinnatum blue form. I've got some other varieties I'll show you later. And this is an Epipremnum Aureum Marble Queen, and I've got some other Aureums to show you later. So the main differences between them, you will probably see between these two plants that I've got. The Pinnatum varieties generally have longer and sharper looking leaves, pointier leaves that are maybe a lance shape or a spear shape, and even seem to be a bit more spaced out, whereas these ones on the Aureum are much broader, rounder leaves and more compact, lots more leaves going on the stems. As they mature, that's where you can really tell the differences as well. So the Pinnatum tends to develop the leaves faster than the Aureum does. So the Pinnatum leaves will start to develop fenestrations and pinnation. So that is where the leaves sort of split off down the edges, a bit like Monstera leaves if you think of those, and they split off down the edges a lot faster than the Aureum will. So this will take longer for the leaves to mature and start to develop fenestrations and pinnation. Now, despite the mix-up in names, the care needs for the different varieties are pretty much the same. So what I run through today will be applicable whether you've got Pinnatums, Aureums or even Amplicimums. So let's start with night. These are fantastic versatile plants. They prefer a spot with bright indirect light, which will give them their optimal growth and colour. However, they are tolerable of low light situations as well. They might just grow a little bit slower in low light situations. If the light's too light, they might lose some of their variegational colour as well. But generally they are really versatile and can go pretty much anywhere in the home so long as there is somewhere with natural lighting. But as I said, if you want the faster growth and really good colour, bright indirect light is best. Avoid direct sunlight as that can burn the leaves, much like with many other houseplants. Now, just like the lighting, these are really versatile and really easy to care for plants when it comes to watering. So you can generally let the soil dry out between watering, or at least let the top of the soil dry out between watering, and then give it a top up. They are drought tolerant, so they will forgive you if you forget to water it occasionally. They might show you that they haven't been watered in a while by drooping. Give them some water and they will recover really well. The main thing to look out for this is overwatering, so never let them sit in damp soil or excess water, as that can lead to issues like root rot and the stems going mushy and leaves dropping off, for example. So let at least the top of the soil dry out between watering and then give them a top up. And that leads nicely onto the soil. So as we were saying, we don't want them to sit in wet soil, so we want a well-draining soil, maybe a slightly looser texture. So we could use something like a soil or a core base with things in there to break it up and give it that looser, well-draining texture, like bark chips, wood chips, maybe some perlite, something like that, and then that should give it the drainage that it needs. Now, when it comes to fertiliser, even though these are foliage heavy houseplants and they grow really quickly in the right conditions, they don't actually need as much fertiliser as maybe some of our other houseplants do. So these can generally have a solution diluted down to half the usual solution, or used less frequently and only during the growing season. So I use a water soluble fertiliser, mix it in with the water, and then I'll use that every 2 to 4 weeks, again depending on the size of the plants and how much I think they might need. This, I think I've made a mistake with this one in that I think I've been watering my usual houseplants with maybe the full strength fertiliser, and I've actually given this some and it's caused some blotching on the leaves. So less is always more when it comes to the fertiliser. Learn from my mistake with this one, and if you notice any damage to the leaves, then reduce the fertiliser, the dilution or the frequency of the fertiliser that you're using. Now, when it comes to temperature and humidity, I've grouped these together as they don't really have any special care needs when it comes to these, but there are some tips to run through. So for temperature, anywhere between 15 and 25 degrees Celsius, give or take a few degrees, and that should be fine. Obviously, if you've got any spots in your home that vary in temperature, try to avoid those, such as by windows, doors or radiators. They won't like the inconsistency of changing temperatures, just like many other houseplants wouldn't like those spots either. And then when it comes to humidity, they're generally fine with the humidity in our homes, unless you've got a particularly dry home, such as having the aircon on all the time or radiators on all the time, then you might want to increase the humidity. Now when it comes to propagating your Epipremnums, it's really easy to do, and there are a couple of different methods that you can use. So generally you would use stem propagation or a process similar to air layering, which I'll show you in just a moment. Now depending on the method that you're using, there are a few things that you need to get started. So the first, of course, with any method is a healthy piece of plant material. It's always good practice to water the plant that you're going to be taking a cutting from at least 30 minutes before taking the cutting, so that that piece has any water and nutrients that it needs, because obviously it's going to have limited ability to get those once it's been cut and while it waits to produce roots. So the next things that you'll need, if you're using the water method for the stems, then you need some water in a clear container, preferably so you can see the progress if it's developing roots. Some fresh soil in a clean container, again if you're using the soil method, or if we're using the air layering method or the method that's similar to air layering. And then if we're using that latter method, then you might need some hooks or paper clips as well, plus some clean cutting utensils to take the cutting from the plant. So for stem propagation, you want to select a healthy piece of plant material. If you look at the stem of your Epipremnums, you'll see that behind the leaves there are generally little growths where the suckers would usually be, which is what they use to climb trees in their natural habitat, or maybe attached to moss poles. So this is where the roots would develop too. So we want to find where one of these is on the stem and then cut just before it, so that that is present when we put it in soil or water. And you also maybe want a leaf or two on the cutting. So with this stem that I've got, I'm actually using the plant that I potentially over fertilised and caused a bit of damage to, but it's got a really long stem here with lots of propagation potential. So we're going to use this one to get started today. So I've got various different leaves on here, and as you can see there are lots of little growths underneath all of those. So I'm probably going to get 2 cuttings out of this actually with the length of stem. If I cut it just here, I think I've got 1 cut in here, and then I will also cut it again a little bit further down the stem to get a second cut in just here. And then what I will do with both of these, I'm going to remove the lower 2 leaves just so that they're not in the water or the soil. I might cut those off rather than accidentally damage the stem, so I'm just going to snip those off. So we've got a clean piece of stem, still with a couple of leaves on. As you can see, there is where the previous leaf was and the little growths on the back, and there's another one just there, and then 2 leaves on top. And I'm going to do exactly the same as what I've just done with this one. So this actually has a wonderful leaf on top and a new leaf on the way, but what I'll do is just get rid of those bottom leaves so they don't cause any issues in the water. And there we go, there's another really good piece of stem with those growth points on that should hopefully produce roots once they're in water. And it's really, really easy. So all we would do with those is, for the water method, just pop those into the water. They're being a bit unruly, but just try and get those into the jar, and then hopefully you'll start to see roots over time. Change the water every week or so that it's fresh. If you notice any blackening or any of it rotting, just remove that, and if it's still healthy beyond that, just remove the bad bits and then put it back in water and be patient and wait for roots. Once the roots are maybe 1 to 2 centimeters long, then you can pot it up in the soil mix that we mentioned earlier in the care guide. So instead, if I wanted to put these in soil, I would do exactly the same as what I've just done in the water, but I might use, it's optional, some root hormone on these areas and on the end of the stem. That's completely optional, but it might give us a better chance of propagation success. And then I would just make a hole in the soil and then pop this straight into the soil and firm the soil around it. Give it a good water so it's got the moisture that it needs, and then hopefully that will produce roots. Now for the other method that I said was a bit like air layering. It's not technically air layering, but it uses a similar principle. So if you're not familiar with air layering, very, very basically, it's just where you put some growing medium around a piece of a plant that can produce roots, wait for it to produce roots before you then cut it off from the main plant, and then you've got a propagated piece. So this is great because it helps to reduce the risk of wasted plant material, like stems and leaves can sometimes go mouldy, or they just don't produce roots, and then they're wasted. You've already cut them off the plant. Whereas at least with this method, it's still, whatever you're trying to propagate is still connected to the main plant, so it's still getting the nutrients and water that it needs. And then once it develops its own roots and you cut it off, it's already got those roots to be self-sustaining once you pot it up separately. So it's a really good method to use with plants that are suitable for it. So Epipremnums can be used. And as I mentioned, we're just going to look for exactly the same thing as we did with the stem propagation, those little growth points underneath the leaves. And all you're going to need to do is get some fresh soil, place this on top of the soil like so, and then you just want to use something to hold it in place. This is where I said the paper clips, or if you've got any horticultural staples or anything like that that can be used for this, just to hold it in place. And all I'll do is just gently rearrange the soil as well, so a little bit's over the stem as well, and then I'll just keep that moist too. So that's now held in place. Once I think it might have produced roots, I can then remove the hooks, and if it's still anchored to the soil and still attached, then that's a really good sign. So then I can cut it away from the main plant, and then we've got a successfully propagated piece of plant without the risk of it potentially going bad like these stems or leaves that I mentioned earlier. So before we look at the varieties that I've got here today, we'll have a quick look at some tips to get fuller looking plants. So the first one is that these actually like to be quite snug in the pot, so you can really fill up the pot. If you are taking propagations, rather than using a separate pot for that, you can just cut pieces off, put them straight back in the pot with the mother plant, and then hopefully if they're successful they'll produce new growth and you've got a fuller looking plant. If they're not successful, just remove them and try again. Or you might propagate them in water, for example, or a separate pot. Then once they do have roots, you know they're successful, then pop them up again with the mother plant to give that fuller looking plant. Another method that you can use is, it sounds counterintuitive, but pruning and cutting the plant back. So when you cut the plant back, you change where the concentrations of the plant hormones are. So at the moment, this is focused on growing the vines in a linear fashion. So all the growth promotion is coming to the ends of the vines, but if you cut those off, it will then promote side shoots and additional growth, which will then fill out the plants with that new growth as well. So there's different methods that you can use, so you can choose whichever works best for you and the Epipremnums that you've got. Now I'll do a quick run through of the different varieties that I've got here with me today. So I'll tell you the name and show you what each of them are. Some are the Aureum species and some are the Pinnatum species. As I mentioned earlier, the difference, and see if you can spot that difference as I'm showing you. So I'll start with the Aureum ones, and the one that I was just holding actually just a moment ago is probably the best one to go for, as this is the most common one that you've probably seen, the Golden Pothos or Epipremnum Aureum, which a lot of these other ones are, I believe, based off different cultivars of. And this one is the one with the wonderful green leaves and the different sort of blotches or patches of yellow to cream variegation. Now this next one is one of my favourites. This is the Epipremnum Aureum Marble Queen, and as you can see, this one has beautiful marbling of the leaves, different shades of green and lots of white variegation. So this is a really wonderful bright plant to have in the collection, and all of the leaves are very unique. And this next one is the Epipremnum Aureum Enjoy, and as you can see, it's got slightly smaller leaves than the ones we were just looking at, but still with that wonderful variegation. And these ones are really striking because they've got the solid green with the solid cream to white variegation on all of the leaves, and each of the leaves are very unique. And this next one is another type of Enjoy, but you'll see it looks quite different from the Enjoy that I was just showing you. This is the Enjoy Gold, and you'll see the colouring of the variegation is different. Rather than that white to cream, it's more of a yellow or gold colour, as the name would suggest. The leaves are also larger, more like the standard type of Epipremnum Aureum, and you might actually think it looks quite similar to that, which in fairness it does, but where this maybe differs is this one has more variegation and more sort of marbling of the variegation across the leaves. And this next one is one of my favourites just because of how bright it is. So this is quite a common variety. You might already have this in your houseplant collection, or they're readily available in houseplant stores or online. This is the Epipremnum Aureum Neon. As the name suggests, very bright. Unlike having solid green leaves or really any variegation, these have solid lime green or even yellow to gold leaves. Even the stems are the same colour, so a very bright plant and a fantastic one to have in the houseplant collection. Now this next one is the Epipremnum Aureum Global Green, and unlike the ones that we've looked at with the white cream or gold variegations, these ones actually have different variations or different shades of green marbled across the leaf or in patches, so they still have a little bit of that colour variation for that visual impact, but maybe not quite as standout as the variegated versions, but they still have a wonderful sort of lush tropical vibe to them. So I think I've covered off all of the Aureums in the collection, but there are more available, so check online and see all of the different varieties that you can get in your houseplant collection. So I will start with the Pinnatum ones now, and again you can probably see straight away, as I showed you earlier, the difference in the leaf shape. This one is the one that I was propagating via the air layering, not air layering method. This is the Epipremnum Pinnatum Blue Form, and it has really solid green leaves. I don't know why it's called blue form unless the leaves maybe are meant to look a little bit blue, but they're a very dark green. They start quite light and then get much darker, and they have this wonderful pointed, long pointed lance shape and nice trailing vines. But the leaves, unlike the leaves on the Aureum vines that we were looking at before, they tend to grow in little bunches of leaves. I don't know if I can bring this closer to the camera so that I can show you that without pulling it out of this part. If I bring this a little bit closer, hopefully the camera will show what I'm talking about. Rather than having the leaves going down the stem like the others, they tend to bunch the leaves up in little groups. So this one is the Cebu Blue, and as you can see, this one is quite different from the one that I was just showing you, the blue form. This one is quite a lot lighter, and the leaves are maybe a bit longer and wider as well. So this one has almost silvery green leaves with a nice shimmer to them, as you can see in the light there. These ones also develop fenestrations quite early on in the leaves, which give them a little bit more visual interest. So this one is the Cebu Blue. Now this next one is the Epipremnum pinnatum variegata, or variegated Epipremnum pinnatum. This is the fastest plant I think I've ever bought. I saw this in a homeware store a couple of days ago for £12.50. That works out at about $15 or $16, and it's a fantastically full plant, not to mention the amazing leaves on it, which I'll just run through. So this one has got some really wonderful variegation on the leaves, which I think drew me to it as well. It's almost silvery to white, so some of the leaves have a silvery variegation on them, whereas other ones have a really clear white, like this one, as you can see, almost a half variegated leaf. And the shape of the leaves as well are just so varied across the plant. So we've got some young pointed ones, as we said, the pinnatum has pointier leaves down here, but as they develop, they also develop fenestrations down the centre of the leaf, as well as pinnation, where they start to split off down the sides as well, a bit like monstera leaves or mature Epipremnum leaves. So it looks like this has been potted up with more mature pieces of Epipremnum pinnatum, which is why it's getting these wonderful mix of the more mature looking leaves and the younger looking leaves. Now this next one's a really unusual one, and I wonder if you've seen it before. So if you have watched my video from last week, the houseplant haul unboxing, which I had this and several other plants, you will have already seen it, but if you haven't watched that, then this is the Epipremnum pinnatum skeleton key. And the reason I bought this was because it was so different from anything that I'd seen before, and the leaves are just really unique. So just like the other pinnatums that we've looked at, this one does have some of the younger leaves as these long lance-shaped pointed leaves, but as the leaves mature, or as new mature leaves come out, should I say, they develop a completely different shape, where they almost develop 3 points with a much longer point in the middle. So that's a very young, smaller leaf that's come out. But then we've got the larger leaves. If I bring that a little bit closer so you can see that, the 3-point shape with the long point down the middle. And they also develop fenestrations down the centre of the leaf. I'm not sure if you can see that on the camera, they're very, very small, but just like the other pinnatum that we looked at, the pinnatum variegata, they have fenestrations down the centre of the leaf as well. So I just really loved the variety on this plant of the lance-shaped leaves, the 3-pointed leaves, and even though they follow the same structure, they're all very unique and slightly different in their own way. And this one looks a little bit straggly at the moment, but it's because it's on a moss pole and the vine has started to come off the moss pole. So what I'm going to do, the consensus from last week's video, the viewers said to extend it. So I'm going to put an extension on the moss pole and see how tall we can grow it. Now this next one isn't an Aureum or a Pinnatum, this is actually the Epipremnum amplissimum, but I thought I'd show you this anyway as we're talking about Epipremnums. And the care guide and propagation tips follow the same with this too. So these ones, as you can see, have got much longer, thinner leaves, and all of the leaves are the same sort of shape. This one's been in propagation for a while, but I desperately need to pot it up. Possibly I might need to break the glass even to get it out, because it's developed quite a bit since it's been in there. And you can see the colour on the leaves as well. It's got this wonderful dark green colour with silver to white stripes down the middle of it. So these ones look really fantastic, really interesting visual appeal when they've got masses of these long leaves on more mature plants. Hopefully this will develop like that once it's potted up. And they look almost a little bit more like palms or Dracaenas as opposed to Epipremnums. So that just shows the great variety of Epipremnums that you can get with different sort of aesthetics to them, depending on what it is that you're after. So what was your favourite out of the varieties that I've shown you today? Let me know in the comments below. Of course, there are lots of other varieties available, many of which are on my wishlist for the ones that I don't have in the collection yet. If you have found this video interested in learning more about Epipremnums, particularly the difference between Pinnatum and Aureum and how to care for and propagate Epipremnums, then consider subscribing, as I have new videos every week, usually on plant related topics. I'll link my previous video at the end, which is a houseplant haul unboxing, which has some fantastic plants in, probably the best plant haul I've had yet. So I'll link that at the end if you want to watch that next. If you've got any questions, then put them in the comments below and I'll respond to everyone. And as always, thank you for watching Grow Your Wellbeing.